Now, although it can't be absolutely confirmed that she's the first PM not to take the oath, it certainly ensured that Julia's religion has become a talking point in her first week on the job, and she was straightforward in telling ABC Radio that she's not a religious person, and nor was she going to pretend a faith that she did not feel. But it might be argued that the fact that such questions are being asked is one measure of how things in Australia have changed. Marion is the leading authority on religion and politics in Australia. She's Associate Professor and Director of the Centre for Social Inclusion at Macquarie, and she joins me in our Sydney studio. Welcome back, Marion, to a Little Wireless program. Blessings be upon you.
And upon you too, Philip.
Were you pleased that she took an affirmation?
Well, the idea of taking an affirmation, we've had Australian politicians before who've taken them for religious reasons. You don't actually have to be an atheist to take an affirmation. In fact, it was brought in the English Parliament for the benefit of Quakers rather than of atheists.
Right.
So people who take very seriously when Jesus said, "Let your yes be yes and your no be no, and do not swear by anything in heaven, on earth or under the earth."
I like that. That's what the Governor General should have said. That's terrific.
Right. So taking an affirmation doesn't necessarily mean that you're not religiously committed, although in her case it does. But what I think is lovely about it is that it just confirms what we already know, that Australia is a place for a lot of different people with a lot of different beliefs.
Being a God-botherer was a bit of a problem for Rudd when he was trying to get the leadership, and we'd often sit and talk about it because there was some resistance to God-bothering in caucus, and that led to the argument, the suggestion that he write an essay for the Monthly where he declared his connections to Bonhoeffer. And of course in the early stage of his prime ministership, John Howard did identify religiously, did he not?
John Howard, well, he did in the sense that he talked about Australia being a Christian nation, being founded on what he called Judeo-Christian values, and he railed against what he saw as a falling away of Christianness, like department stores not having nativity scenes at Christmas time. He never really told us that he was a very religious person. I remember Geraldine Doog asking him on Compass. He said, well, I go to church a bit more often than Christmas and Easter, but not all that often. And she asked him what denomination he preferred, and he said, it matters not to me. So you didn't get the feeling of somebody with a sort of profound religious sense of their own, but he put a lot of effort into positioning Australia as having a particular religious identity.
Bob Hawke didn't believe in God. I'm sure Gough doesn't. He said he never went to church. No one asks about the Frasers.
No.
No one seemed to care, did they?
Back in those days, no, nobody did.
Keating was a tribal Catholic, like the Kennedys.
Yeah, exactly. And he did some religious gestures like kissing the ground on the Kokoda Trail and talking about the Prime Minister having a responsibility to care for the spirituality of the nation, but he didn't do any sort of formal religious things.
And yet there were lingering religious tensions in the ALP after the famous split.
Well, I think that's a big part of the reason why in the 70s when I was growing up, people didn't talk about religion politically because, like, in 1999, I did the research for my first book. I went around and interviewed a whole lot of politicians about their religious beliefs, and particularly the older ones on the Labor side. I'd go and say, I'm writing a book about religion and politics, and they'd say, oh, I don't remember too much about that. That was a long time ago. I don't think I can be much help to you, dear. It was religion and politics in Labor Party sort of genetic memory just meant one thing, and that one thing was political death.
What if you were in Australian politics in one form or another and you came from another direction, say a Jewish background? Was that made to matter? I'm thinking, say, of Zelman Cowen.
Well, there have been Jews prominent in Australian politics going right back to the first Parliament, Sir Isaac Isaacs. And actually, the first Parliament, when they debated opening with prayers, they worried about that. They thought really hard. They thought, we don't want anything that sounds too Christian, because they knew they had people from other faiths there. And although they decided to use the Lord's Prayer for opening, and we still use it today, they did discuss it and said, look, there's really nothing in here that a member of the Hebrew faith or any other faith couldn't agree with, and in fact there's nothing to put off an atheist. So they were very conscious of that issue even back then.
You know a secret of this program. You know that we always do the Lord's Prayer before we go on air, don't you? But
I missed it.
But you were late tonight.
Oh,
you were
sorry.
late tonight. What about Tony Abbott? His religiosity is worn on his sleeve and other places. And do you think he might take advantage of this religious vacuum at the top?
I think my guess is this might already be happening, because when I listened to the discussion between Chris Pine and Chris Bowen on the breakfast program this morning, and Christopher Pine, both of them asked about how she'd said that she doesn't believe in God, and Christopher Pine immediately said, well, I'm a practicing Catholic, Tony Abbott's a practicing Catholic, and I thought, that sounds like we're getting the point of differentiation, because...
Well, it's at least a chance for Tony to differentiate himself and ramp things up a bit.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny, back in the mid-90s when, the current prominence of religion in public life, that we are actually interested in whether the Prime Minister believes in God or not, whereas we weren't very interested in whether Hawke, Keating, Fraser or Whitlam believed in God.
We knew they all believed in themselves.
That's right.
There seemed to be more than enough. Look, you're very interesting on one issue. I was persuaded that the religious vote helped Kevin get elected in 2007. You think this is dodgy analysis?
I do.
Tell us why.
It's a furphy. Well, first of all, the religious vote just doesn't work in Australia in the way that, say, we know that there is a religious block vote in America and it matters, and as you were hinting before, no president can get in without it. But there are two very important differences between Australia and America. One of them is that we have compulsory voting. The biggest thing that an American president has to do is get the punters to get up in the morning and go out to the polls and cast a vote. And religious issues are very good for getting people who aren't very politically engaged, might otherwise not care, but can be motivated to think, I've got to go out and do it, for the unborn or for a moral principle that they associate with their faith. So in America, religion does a job that it just doesn't do here, because we all vote already, because we have to. And so people who are inclined to vote conservatively will already be voting for one of the conservative parties. But you also make the point
that people confused big Labor votes in electorates with mega churches with the real demography of religious attendance, that often those people lived outside the electorate who go to those big churches.
That's right. The argument that there was a Christian swing to Labor in 2007 was based on the idea that there were swings in seats that have mega churches in them, mega churches being these Hillsong-like churches with 2,000 or more people. But if there's one thing we know about mega churches, it's that they're not local. They draw people from all over the city. People sometimes travel for, an hour or more to get to a mega church. And in fact, the way that mega churches market themselves and present themselves includes saying, look at our acres and acres of parking. People come from all over.
A bit like the Crystal Cathedral in Los Angeles.
Exactly. That's, one of the hallmarks is that they're on freeways in industrial park kind of areas that are very easy to get to by car. They have enormous traffic flows. So so that's one thing that I just don't think you can extrapolate from the fact that seats with mega churches in them swung to say that those people in mega churches were voting that way.
But the other thing which we've picked up on our little wireless program is that there's a bit of a change even amongst the Pentecostal or born-agains in the US, and they are becoming a little bit more socially progressive. And here, I would think, and you'd agree with this, I'm sure, that the Pentecostals are widening their social agendas and they're getting a bit more progressive.
Well, they've always come and gone, It's been a kind of handy shorthand since the 70s, I suppose, to think of Pentecostals and fundamentalists as being politically conservative. But back at their origins, the origins of the Pentecostal movement, 1906, the Azusa Street Mission in Los Angeles, they were famous for the hideous mingling of the races, the Los Angeles Times complained, because they had black and white worshipping together. They had women as ministers. They had black leaders. So they've got a past of being very politically progressive. And yes, they went through a phase where not all, but many Pentecostal churches became much more conservative in the middle of the 20th century. But
now they're likely to express concern about the environment, where perhaps Dad and